So, good afternoon to all of you. Sorry for the gap of one day. And again, I'm here with the same history of the Caribbean literature. You know, the day before yesterday, I told you some points about the history of Caribbean literature, right? I began it with the term, the Caribbean literature. And I told you how it is closely related to the Caribbeans. And I also told you how in the 1960s, the Caribbean authors started recording their individual identity and the problems of their community. Then I told you how some English-speaking regions of the Caribbean islands like Guyana, Jamaica, Barbados, and Trinidad, they got independence, and recently they all have got independence. Fine. After that, I told you that the racial problems and social tensions of the people of these islands gave way to literature in the Caribbean islands. So literature in the Caribbean islands is a product of the social tensions and racial problems of the local people of these areas. Fine. Then I told you that many of the Caribbean authors have been educated abroad and they return to their homelands once in a while, and this created a sense of dislocation, historical void, and a sense of, the lack of culture. So Caribbean literature lacks culture, and the reason is that most of the Caribbean authors were educated abroad and they return to their homelands rarely. Fine. Then I told you that the Caribbean literature has no specific history because the only recorded history in the Caribbean islands is that of imperialism, when the colonizers from Western Europe brought loaded slave ships from different countries of West Africa to work on the island plantations. And you know how these, people were treated. They were treated like objects and they were treated like commodities who could be bought and sold at the will of their white masters, right? Then we came to know how the Emancipation Act of 1863 came into existence, and it abolished slavery, and after it a new kind of labor force came into existence. It was called the indentured labor, which was particularly imported from India and China, right? Then I told you that the Caribbean people live within a culture that is transplanted and transposed and mainly decided by the white races that gave the colonized people their language and education. Means the colonizers gave language and education to the colonized people. Fine. So the thing is that they are living within a culture that is mainly transplanted and transposed and decided by the white masters, right? And that's why the sense of exile and the loss of place and identity crisis, these are the main issues in the Caribbean literature. I mean, these have been the major problems and these have been the major issues in the Caribbean literature. So these are some of the points that I have already covered in the history of the Caribbean literature. Now, in continuation to this, I have some more points in relation to the history of the Caribbean literature. And the first point is the agony of language. So language was a major problem for the local people of the Caribbean islands. How? Let us try to have a look at it. See, nationalism received a fresh color of life when some attempts were made to launch a movement for Negro Brotherhood in Jamaica, and it was done in between the two world wars. Actually, some intellectuals, some people, they tried to unite the black people. Why? So that they could fight with the white masters and with the colonizers, right? So what happened? Some intellectuals and some scholars, they tried to revive local culture by experiments with the language of the colonizers and at the same time religious myths of the past and local music and native dialects, they were brought to the front and English was gradually replaced by Creole. Now what is Creole? Creole is basically a mixture of one European language and one local language. Say for example, in Jamaica, the local dialect of Jamaica with fusion of one European language will give way to a Creole, right? So a Creole is a mixture of one European language and one local language, right? So initially I told you that some slaves were brought by the Western, colonizers. And these slaves on the Caribbean islands were brought from different regions of Africa. So what was the problem? The problem was that they didn't have a common language to share. Because, they all were coming from different areas of Africa. And in different areas of Africa, dialects were different, the languages were different. And they were brought to the Caribbean islands. So when they were brought to the Caribbean islands, they could not communicate with one another because they were coming from different language backgrounds. So it posed a problem before all of them. I mean, they didn't have a common language to share. And that's why, they tried to find out an option, and this option was, found out in the form of Creoles. I mean, they developed some Creoles. I mean, the mixture of some local language and the European language, whether French or English, as the case might be, right? So it was basically a kind of the dilemma of language. And this dilemma of language is termed as agony of language by Edward Bow. Edward, E-D-W-A-R-D, Edward Bow, B-A-U-G-H, right? So this dilemma of language is termed as agony of language by Edward Bow. Right? Thus, English became the language of official business, and it also became the language of the upper class society, and Creole, it became the language of the underprivileged, the poor, the labor class, and the black pigeons, and the indentured labor that was brought from China and India. So this was the time of creolization in literature. And the experiment was implemented in literature also. So this experiment of creolization in literature of the island, it was used by Edward Braithwaite for the very first time in his book. I'm quoting the name of the book, that is Rites of Passage. Rites of Passage. And it was published in 1967. So I repeat again, the experiment of creolization in the literature of the island was used by Edward Braithwaite for the very first time in his book, Rites of Passage. Fine. Now this book is supposed to be the starting point of West Indian literary studies. I mean, this book is the beginning point for the study of the West Indian literature. Fine. Now, if we try to have a look at the present scenario of the West Indian literature, we find that today West Indian literature includes a spectrum of various kinds of writings from different islands, because different islands are there. So West Indian literature includes a deep spectrum of various kinds of writings from different islands. But interestingly, they all have common goals and they all have common interests. So what are their common goals? Their common goals are to resist the white colonizers and to resist their values, Western values. And at the same time, their common interest is, or their common interests are, just to talk about the problems of the local people, racial problem, and the problem of identity crisis. These are the main issues in the Caribbean literature, right? Now let us try to have a look at the 18th and the 19th centuries in the West Indies, right? During the 18th and the 19th centuries, the West Indian literature imitated the British literature, the British norm. But later, with the passage of time, they developed their own identity and sensibility. So you can relate it with the condition of Indian literature. India has also been a colony of the British. So during the initial phase, we people, the Indian authors, we also imitated the British authors because we were able to read the British authors only. The only available material before us or with us was, just this British matter. So during the initial phase, we also imitated the British literature, and later, with the passage of time, we developed our own sensibility. Today, Indian literature has its own sensibility, and it is very, very developed today. Fine. So in the same way, the West Indian literature, initially, it also imitated the British norms and British literature, but with the passage of time, it also developed its own identity and sensibility. Right? Now, Claude McKay and H.G. Lisser. These are the two authors. Claude McKay, M-C-K-A-Y. Claude McKay and H.G. Lisser, L-I-S-S-E-R, Lisser. So they are the two authors who gave original voice to the Caribbean writings. Fine. Let us try to talk about McKay. McKay is classified a Black American writer, and he wrote a famous novel, Home to Harlem. Home to Harlem, H-A-R-L-E-M. And it was published in 1928. Fine. Actually, McKay left Jamaica out of frustration, and he became the first self-exiled Caribbean writer to live abroad. Fine. He was a native of, one of the islands of the West Indies, but out of frustration, he left his home place, his native place, and he is called the first self-exiled Caribbean writer to live abroad. Fine. Now his poetry shows his preoccupation with Jamaican dialect. Actually, he was a Jamaican. So his poetry and his poems, they show his preoccupation with Jamaican dialect. And his only motto was to resist and reject Western values and evoke native culture in his works. Fine. So this has been the single aim of this author. He wanted to resist and reject Western values and Western culture, and at the same time he wanted to evoke native culture in his works. But I think this was not enough. This was not enough. With the works of these authors, the West Indian literature could not get real identity. The Caribbean literature got real identity with the entry of George Lemming on the Caribbean literary scenario. George Lemming, G-E-O-R-G-E, L-A-M-M-I-N-G, George Lemming. Right? So I repeat, the Caribbean literature got real identity with the entity of or with the arrival of George Lemming on the literary scenario of the Caribbean islands. Fine. he wrote a novel. The name of the novel is In the Castle of My Skin. In the Castle of My Skin, and it was published in 1953. Now, this novel is supposed to be a trendsetter in the history of, the West Indian literature, right? Then his success was followed by other writers also. Now, who are these other writers? They are like Roger Mais, Rogermais, Roger Mais. Then the other one is V.S. Reid, V.S. Reid, R-E-I-D, V.S. Reid. Fine. And the other author is Samuel Selvan. Samuel, S-A-M-U-E-L, Samuel Selvan, S-E-L-V-O-N, Selvan. And the other one is V.S. Naipaul. You are very much aware of V.S. Naipaul, and he belongs to the Indian diaspora. I mean, he was born here and later he settled in Trinidad. Fine. Now, Selvan basically portrayed the Indians in Trinidad in his novel A Brighter Sun. So this is the name of the novel written by him, and it was published in 1952. Fine. And Roger Mais, he presented an urban community in Kingston, and he did it in his book. The name of the book is The Hills Were Joyful Together. I repeat, The Hills Were Joyful Together. And it was published in 1953. Right? Now let us talk about the development of fiction and poetry and drama in the Caribbean literature. And for your kind information, fiction occupied pride of place in the Caribbean literature, and it was only later that poetry and drama received any recognition. So novel got recognition first, and poetry and drama got recognition, later. Fine. Now, if you talk about the West Indian novelists, they basically spoke of colonialism, alienation, and their present condition in a society confused by its lack of clear identity, because lack of identity was the major issue in the Caribbean islands. So these novelists, they also talked about the lack of clear, identity. Fine. Then if you talk about V.S. Reid, actually his contribution to the Caribbean literature, it is of great value. Like Derek Walcott, he basically turns repeatedly to the stories of Africa, and specifically he turns to the stories of the Momo rebellion. Momo rebellion. Now, what is this Momo rebellion? Actually, this Momo rebellion or Kenya emergency. Momo rebellion is also known as Kenya emergency. So it was a military conflict, and it took place in the British Kenya between 1952 to 1960. I repeat again, this Momo rebellion or Kenya emergency. It was a military conflict that took place in British Kenya between 1952 to 1960. And it involved Momo, the white settlers, and the British army. Fine. Let me simplify it. Momo was basically a secret society of the farmers of Kenya. Momo, M-A-U. So this Momo was a secret society of the farmers of Kenya, and these farmers were forced out of the highlands, out of the highland by the British people. So they revolted against them, and their only goal was to eliminate the white farmers from their land. Fine. So when we talk about V.S. Reid, V.S. Reid basically he turns to the stories of Africa, and specifically he turns to the Momo rebellion. Fine. Then the other author is Roger Mize. Roger Mize, M-A-I-S, Roger Mize. Fine. Roger Mize talks of dislocation, and he talks of entity problem and the loss of place, right? And one more thing is particular in the very works of Roger Mize, and that is the reference of Rastafarian movement. The Rastafarian movement, R-A-S-T-A-F-A-R-I-A-N, Rastafarian movement. Fine. So it takes shape for the first time in the works of Roger Mize. Now what is Rastafarian movement? Now try to understand. Actually, this movement, it was a religious movement of the origin of Jamaica, and it basically deals with the prophecy that was made by Marcus Garvey, M-A-R-C-U-S, Marcus Garvey, G-A-R-V-E-Y, Marcus Garvey. He was a black political leader. Fine. So, Rastafarian movement, it deals with the prophecy that was made by Marcus Garvey, who was a black political leader. What was the prophecy? The prophecy was that Emperor Haile Selassie, Emperor Haile, H-A-I-L-E, Haile Selassie, S-E-L-A-S-S-I-E. So he was the emperor of Ethiopia, right? So this prophecy stated that the Emperor Haile Selassie of Ethiopia, he was the Messiah, and the blacks are the chosen people, and they will return to their African homeland because they have been made out of their homeland. So once again, under the leadership of this Messiah, they'll be going back to their homeland, that is the African land, right? Then the other author who is also a dramatist, and this is Derek Walcott. The author is in your syllabus also, and we have to deal with the poem of Derek Walcott, right? Now his poetry is also affected by the colonial question, and he is particularly concerned with the problem of negritude. Negritude. Now what is negritude? N-E-G-R-I-T-U-D-E. Negritude. Actually it is an ideological philosophy, and it was started by the Caribbean intellectuals in 1930s in France to revolt colonizers. So negritude, it was an ideological philosophy that was started by some Caribbean intellectuals in France in 1930s, and it was started to revolt the white colonizers. Fine. So when we talk about all these authors, which I have just mentioned in this clip, they all talk about the same issue. They all have common goals. They all have common interests. And the destination is one, and this destination is how to resist the colonizers and how to reject the Western values and Western culture, and how to revoke their own culture, how to revoke their own language, and how to revoke their own myths, their own music, their own folklores, and their own dialects. Fine. So some particular questions, which are the questions of, the question of exile, the question of identity crisis, and the very important question is that of the rape of the land. the rape of the local land. It means the local land of Africa. It was raped by the white settlers and the white colonizers in all the possible ways. They try to humiliate the local people, and at the same time they usurped their land. It means they raped their land. Fine. So, exile, the rape of the land, identity crisis, rootlessness, dislocation. So these are some of the issues which are recurrently, referred to in the Caribbean literature. So I think this is something about the history of the Caribbean literature. And, after this clip, I'll be coming with the poem that is Ruins of a Great House. Fine. Thank you very much.